There are 1,000 stories in the Envisioners' future. This is just one of them.
Well, hello, blimey. Is it that time already? It clearly is. So how are you doing? Thanks again for joining us. Great to have you with us as always. It's been a fantastic week. I've had some major achievements this week. I'd like to share them with you if you'll humour me. First is this. In the eternal quest for trying to find the core of the proposition that we bring to you once a week, we've been to the future of work through a range of audiences. We've been to just the future of work. But now, ladies and gentlemen, I give you what is essentially the subtitle of, I think, my next book, which is The Rise of the Humans, Dialing into the Future of Work. Do you see what I did there? How amazing is that? I'm really chuffed with that. It took me a week to figure that out. And let me show you the second achievement this week. Again, I'm very, very proud to check this out. Check this out. Look at that. If you're enjoying this, please, if you like the content, subscribe and ring the bell, I think is the YouTube term. So if you could just humour me, test that works. Click on the like button, click on the subscribe button if you haven't already, and then ring the bell and you'll get notified when we broadcast again. So with that in mind, today's a really, really good show. We've got another report for you this week. This one is about the virtuals of virtual. And we have with us a couple of fantastic friends, one of them whom you know, one of them you won't know. So if I could just introduce you very quickly. You know Mr. Nick Morris. Nick, how are you doing?
Very good. Nice to see you, Dave. How's things?
Very, very good. And we also have with us Dr. Brendan, oh Jesus, that's a bad start. Brennan Jacoby, who is the author of this report. How are you doing, Brennan?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Dave. Great to join you both.
Thank you so much for having us. So look, this report is super cool and we're going to dive into it. Before we do, you know we always have a bit of housekeeping. Normally I use it as an opportunity to brag/sell where I've been doing what I've been talking about, but not this week, because this week I wanted to call your attention to an article that, you remember Richard Tyler, he was with us a few weeks ago talking about mental well-being and the whole sort of kindness matters thing. He wrote a really important piece and also did a live stream on high functioning anxiety, which I thought was actually bang on actually, and especially a lot of the conversations I've been having recently with business leaders and people in organizations who are frankly at a point of extreme stress. I think by now, what are we, 14 weeks in? I don't know, a long way in to all of this, so that's well worth a read if you get the chance. And also just a plug for last week's show, which was all about education. Superb engagement and feedback about that. Clearly we hit a nerve with how parents are feeling, how teachers are feeling. If you haven't already checked it out, that's a great thing to check out. We are eternally grateful to our sponsors, Treble 3, who will do a fantastic job of any of your digital needs, not just print, not just website, but the whole ball of wax. They've been busy. Here's their sort of latest client doing a whole bunch of stuff. The thing I love about Treble 3 is just the diversity of the stuff that they can do. You give them an idea, they can take it anywhere, they can make it happen, as you well know. And as I was reflecting on this with the stuff that they did for the stage show, God, wouldn't it be nice to get out on stage again or to get out to one of these events? So hopefully this was, I couldn't believe it's over a year ago now that since we were doing this in Cheltenham, but you'd love to get out there and do that. So anyway, Treble 3, absolutely amazing. Treble3.co.uk. We've been proud to work with them for over a decade now. Fantastic. Give them a shout when you can. And so without any further ado, let's get straight into the story. And look, we've been talking about this story for the last 11 weeks. Do you remember what it was like 11 or 12 weeks ago when we started in lockdown and we were all quite excited about it and we found out what Zoom was doing and it wasn't Zoom great and we were high-fiving each other on Zoom calls and it was brilliant. And then we had this call, you know, Steve, you're on mute, Steve, nobody can hear you, Steve. Jesus Christ, mate. Don't touch your glasses. No, Steve, leave your glasses. No, Steve. And now we're here in this place where it's like, I get it. And I quite like it. I still like my commute better than my old commute, but I miss the office. I miss the sanctity of being somewhere else where I could talk to other people about what might be happening in the outside world. How are we going to do this? How are we going to make it happen? How do we figure out how we walk out through this tunnel? I've talked before about this. The light at the end of the tunnel is not the oncoming train. It is our gateway to the 21st century. And yet what I'm really, really worried about is I think the perceived path of least resistance is going to be going back to doing what we used to do. It's going to be perceived to be harder to manage your team in a new sort of semi-virtual, hybrid physical world than it is to say, oh, stuff it, I'm just going back into the office. And especially now the Chancellor's made me sandwiches 50% cheaper than they used to be, or at least when it comes to VAT. So with that in mind, what we wanted to do was to continue this conversation. We wanted to continue to give you the tools in your toolkit that will help you walk forward, to walk through to the end of the channel, to be able to set up your team, to manage your team, to engage with your team in a way that actually brings the best of both virtual and physical. And that's when we came across this. And actually, both Nick and I have worked with Brennan before, and it was great to hear from him to say that he'd been working on this report about the virtues of virtual. And I'm going to bring Brennan in a second, but just to position him, one thing I love about this job I do is you get to see lots of different people who have a really different and interesting perspective on the world of work, right? So I'm a nerd, so I bring you the nerd's eye view of all of this. Brennan's a philosopher, and he brings us a philosopher's viewpoint on the world of work, which I find massively fascinating. And I'm going to open with this question, because part of Brennan's sort of proposition to us all is that we can learn from society's great thinkers. We can learn from the ancient philosophers who can teach us lessons that will be applicable and will be beneficial to us as we emerge into our future world of work. So Brennan, I'm going to open with that. I would like to ask you, seriously, what can Aristotle teach me about Zoom calls and flexible working? I mean, how does that even work?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a great question. And I get where you're coming from very much. And I very quickly want to say that you're right. With philosophy at work and everything that I'm doing, using philosophy and bringing it into the workplace, I want to help people do their best thinking. What I don't want to do is enable people to talk about philosophers more. I don't, I think it's that would be, there's worse things that we could do than talk about Socrates, Aristotle, Nietzsche, Simone de Beauvoir, over coffee or something. But actually what we're trying to do and what we do in the report and we do with everything is trying to say, how are these people who have sort of pursued wisdom throughout the ages, how are they thinking? What are their sort of processes and frames of reference? And then how do we do that ourselves so that we're not just sort of quoting someone like Aristotle, to your point, but rather are doing our best thinking and borrowing from their sort of tips and techniques. And so I would say, I'd be one of the first ones to say that Aristotle wouldn't have known anything about Zoom calls, but he knew a lot about life and about humanity. He spent his life and career, as you would say, thinking deeply about those things. And the thing that struck me at the start of this year and even the end of last year, so an important thing to say is that the report is not a coronavirus report. But as many of us have been noticing, what's going on around the current crisis is it's throwing into stark relief a lot of things that we were already seeing. And so something that struck us when we were starting to think about how we wanted to bring philosophy into remote work and the virtual sort of space was a couple months ago, and we saw people kind of reacting in some pretty extreme ways to what was going on around the virus. But not just that, before it, we saw people sort of going, we're not going virtual, and just sort of putting up a wall and having a sort of pretty extreme underreaction to the prospect of going virtual. And then there were other people that were like, yes, we've got to go virtual really, really fast. And there was almost this overreaction. And because I've, read Aristotle and sort of been going through his work, that made me think of him because it sounds a lot like what he's talking about when he tells us his view on how we ought to live. And what he says is that the right way to live is to try to avoid extremes and instead try to strike a balance. So his view is that the right way to live is to not overshoot or undershoot. He recognized that as humans, that's what we kind of tend to do, but instead try to find balances in the middle. And he just says those balances are just what we should call virtues. So when we talk about the virtues of virtual, it's less about, here's some great things about virtual, sort of the virtues in that sense. More what we're talking about is what are some of the ways that we can approach virtual that is balanced, well-founded, really constructive and positive, because we're avoiding the sort of extremes and learning from them. So what we do in the report is pick out these sort of what we call the 5 virtues of virtual. and try to find ways to apply across different areas of work.
And fantastic, because you anticipated exactly where I was going to go there, because I think what you're really talking about is using, I guess, part of Aristotle's thinking as a framework to help us navigate, to find our own pathway through. And the segue I was looking for was actually you talk about the 5 virtues in the report, and I would love it if in this conversation could you just set up those 5 virtues, if you could just sort of tell us what they are, and then I want to pick each one off and just have a little sort of tinker around and see what we can understand from them.
Yeah. Definitely. I love that idea of having it be a conversation. That's something I really appreciate about what you're doing here. So yeah, I'll just on a very high level introduce them, and then let's unpack them together. So the first one is democracy, and we're talking about using democracy as a virtue, as that balanced way of avoiding overreacting and underreacting in the workplace. Specifically, we're thinking about it with the we're adopting tech. So, for example, in the move to virtual, a lot of times what we see people doing is going, we've got to bring all kinds of new tech in, and we have the extreme reaction of sort of digital proliferation. But then on the other side, you've got people that maybe, like I've felt sometimes, going, I'm not quite sure about some of these tools. I'm going to just try to hobble through with what I used to do. And we're saying, actually, democracy, the way of bringing people into the discussion and asking what tech is working for other people in your team, what do you want to bring in, listening really well and hearing all the voices, that's a really important virtue. Again, not just because it's a virtue in itself, but because it sits in the balance between those extremes. The second one is accountability. And so here we're thinking about extremes of sort of strong-armed control, because gosh, now my team's working in their homes and I can't see them and I don't know if they're actually working. That's one extreme, so I'm going to try to control them, to another extreme of going, I don't want to control them, I'm scared of being a micromanager, so I'm just going to be really hands-off. Neither are really great, they're both understandable, but actually accountability, changing, loosening the grip on full control and instead having accountability, which can be much more sort of self-guided and owned, is a real virtue in that balanced sense. The third one is clarity, so being really clear about our work preferences, when we're going to be available for calls, Zoom, whatever, and when we're just doing deep work. That's a really important virtue to have. And then the fourth one is collegiality. So what we're talking about there is a balance between inviting everyone in to collaborate because we don't want them to feel left out. On the one hand, sort of an overreaction of collaboration, and the underreaction being, I'm just going to be a lone ranger and try to do everything myself because I don't know what people are up to anymore. And instead, the balanced virtue is collegiality, which what we mean by that is just having a strength of relationships outside of the work almost, so that when it comes to doing the actual work, we have enough confidence in our relationships to go, do you know what? I know that person's not going to feel left out if I don't include them in this call. And actually, they don't really need to be here. So I'm going to free them up for something else. And then the fifth one is understanding. And what we mean here is finding ways to really connect with each other in the virtual context. So, I know right now my bandwidth is kind of hurting us all a little bit. I think my video is a bit slow. And that makes it all the harder for us to connect at the moment, let alone the fact that I can't actually look you in the eyes. I have to look in the camera for you to think I'm looking in the eyes, but then I'm not looking at you. So finding ways to connect and understand each other. Those are the 5. So democracy, accountability, clarity, collegiality, and understanding.
That's great. And look, I mean, I love those 5, and I've been through the report very closely, as you might imagine. Let's just pick up on each one and just sort of have a noodle around. And so my starter for 10 on democracy, and part of this is the journey that Nick and I were on many years ago, which was really about this whole concept of essentially the consumerization of technology. So look, if you go back 10 years, the biggest pain in the backside for IT guys in the organization was the bloody users. I mean, bloody hell. Jesus, would you stop using stuff outside of work? I mean, what a nightmare. You'd come in and you'd be using bloody Dropbox and all this insecure stuff. Dropbox isn't insecure, but we would always say it was because it suited us, right? And, and what I love about what you're talking about democracy is this recognition that, A, IT is nothing special, and B, most of us now are having a richer experience in our personal lives than we do at work. And so doesn't it make sense that, we're all, for the most part, adults, come into the organization and say, do you know, the other day I was doing some stuff with my, I don't know, my community group, and we were using Trello, and Trello's really good at this. Does anybody fancy using it? Have you seen it? Here's what we can do. But to open that up, to me, it's kind of like the ultimate destination of the consumerization of IT, which is kind of where it should be, don't you think?
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're trying to talk about when we say democracy. So I should be clear that, when we talk about democracy, what we really mean is the sort of principles of democracy, the sort of spirit of democracy. We're not necessarily saying that everything needs to be done by a vote or something like that. But what we're talking about is that spirit of saying, yeah, let's go out and hear. And actually, in that way, I think we're not just talking about a specific policy around hearing from everyone in the team or the company and what they're using outside of work. We're not just talking about a practical policy in that way. We're talking about a way of thinking about work that is much more suited to the time we're living in now. The previous, what you might have said, the previous virtues of work were based on a philosophy or assumptions that was much more coming out of the early 20th century. So it was, the 9 to 5 days a week kind of thing. The virtues that govern that kind of work were very much hard graft, top-down power, show up when you say you will, and just work hard. And actually these days, there's a different set of values in society. There's a different set of values in workers that are joining. And that means, empathy, understanding, dialogue, flexibility. And so we need to bring that in. And I think that's true of tech, but also true of work more broadly.
No, I love that. And I just was thinking about this sort of concept of democracy and understanding and flexibility. And there's a brilliant sentence in the report, and I'm just going to read it out because it sets up a story. So it says, embrace the stage where virtual sucks a little, because those frictions among leaders, their teams, and the tech mean that the raw materials to build solutions are being mined. And and I do think it's so important. We get hung up on the let's find the perfect solution, and it's not maybe as far to the other side of Facebook's let's find something that works. Good enough is better than done. Oh, good enough is better than perfect, I think was what the phrase was. But it reminds me, I think it was a Churchill quote of, democracy is the worst way of managing a society, except for all the others. And I think we're kind of in that with technology. Do you know what I mean? So Trello is probably the worst way to manage your product, except for all the others. And I kind of like that approach. So rather than trying to find the perfect thing, let's just find something that works the best that's available. So I think there's something very, very nice about that.
And also, David, can I just pick up on? Sorry, Nick. Go.
I was just going to say, isn't that part of the problem as well? That the democracy almost brings about some kind of chaos, too much choice. My form of democracy, the tools that I choose to use, may be very different to someone else's. And we've talked before for a long time about different generations in the workforce and people having different experiences and different preferences to determine what they want to use and when. And too much democracy. And I guess that, as Dave said, and I know we work together on the report, I love the report. The bit that I find challenging is that balance is a really fine line. And my idea of a balance is very different to someone else's. And how do you get that? How do you work towards that without it being too chaotic?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. So I think one thing to clarify is that the balance in Aristotelian senses, so the way that Aristotle would want to talk about it, is the balance is not he would want to say it's practical. It is practical, but it's not practical in the way of saying, well, what I think is a balance between extremes is us acting in this way or doing this thing. You might disagree and think, well, actually, I think us balancing is having one team meeting a week or whatever. It's in the sort of practical terms. What he's talking about in the way that I'm sort of thinking about virtues in the report is that it's a balance between over and under reacting that is a movable feast to some extent. And so the reason I like democracy is because it's not saying, well, we've got to agree on one take on what is democratic every day, in the work that we're doing. It's more about saying the driving principle that helps keep us on in the sort of wide and straight and wide to some extent, when we're trying to navigate change and challenges, is that that spirit of engagement, of saying, who have we not heard from, and opening up the disagreement. And I think that comes back to the quote that Dave read out. Something I like about that sentence, which I have to say, that phrase there about embracing the time when the tech sucks a little, that came out of an interview that we did with John Barnes, who John's an amazing thinker, speaker, just really great person as well, who spoke with us. He's written a lot on democracy in the workplace and sort of self-guided education and work, and that was that sort of sentiment was what he shared. And the reason that I like it is that idea, not so much that we're embracing change, but that we're embracing it when there's a bit of pain. And I think that's really helpful, because if we can say, oh, this is really hard, this is uncomfortable, this is challenging. So even like what you said, Nick, of, oh, there's this bit that I like the report, but I find this bit challenging. I think that's where we need to be, because it's you're putting your finger on something that's really good. So even if it means that, gosh, there's a bit of pain there's a bit of challenge, maybe that means that we need to go back to the report and go, well, is democracy not the right word? Is there something else that's more true to it? But we wouldn't have had that refinement, we wouldn't have made that progress if we hadn't been in touch with what was painful. And so, the thing that when everything sort of feels all right, it's really hard to know how to innovate. But when you've got a sense of where the pain point is, then you've got an idea of what to deal with, And so I think that I like that idea of iterating, of reviewing together. And I think the pain is I don't know, maybe this is a bit too dark for a rainy evening, but the pain is a good guide in a way to where we should be working.
Yeah, but isn't pain always well, it's an indicator of change, isn't it? And hopefully it's an indicator of progress. Let's just hope it's progress in the right way. Look, I want to move this on. I'm a bit conscious of time, and so I want to jump into accountability. And what I found really interesting about accountability, and on the sort of the spectrum of flexible working, there's the lovey side, which is I'm going to work in the open. All of my communications are open and available to everybody. Why you have to talk like this when you talk like that, I don't know, but it kind of fits what being open and engaging versus the very no, I'm locking everything in a box, man, right? And you can't have anything unless I allow to you. But this sense of actually, it's not about being open, although open does make for agility and fluidity of the flow of information, but it's about giving people the space to just crack on and not feeling that they need to be inspected or watched or observed to move forward. So from that perspective, is accountability really trust, or is it more than that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So a lot of times when we talk about trust, when we talk about trustworthiness, we'll talk about transparency. And transparency seems to have a lot of overlap with accountability, openness, trust, but actually they're distinct things. So I think we have trust can be a precursor of accountability. The kind of accountability that we're talking about, by the way, maybe I could just clarify, is we're saying we want to relinquish strong-armed control for accountability, where there's still boundaries. People still need to they're still responsible. They still need to meet, agreed ends and do it in a certain way. It's not sort of the Wild West, but accountability can be self-directed. It can be signed up to, rather than going, this is what you must do. And so that enables us to have an openness. I know we're tight on time, but one source that we talk about in the report is this piece from Harvard Business School, and Professor Ethan Bernstein, who looked at a Chinese tech factory, and they said that when they put up sort of hospital-style curtains around the workers, their efficiency went right up, and it was because they were able to find their own workarounds to problems they were encountering, that if there wasn't this sort of secrecy imposed from the curtains, they would have felt too concerned about having to explain. So they weren't doing anything too dangerous or anything that was really wrong, but it just enabled them to feel a little bit more free to experiment, and that was a really good thing. So it was strategic loss of transparency for the sake of accountability that was actually really effective.
And do you know what, Brennan, has just occurred to me, and I'm kicking myself, is, I mean, that links really closely to the stuff. It was Ben Hammersley actually who did it first. He was talking about the challenge of the open plan office, and it's about this sort of heightened anxiety that humans feel when they are, out in the open, vulnerable. And again, the story is in the open plan office. If you look at where all the workers sit, they sit in the middle with their screens on view to everybody, and the boss is the predator typically who sits in the corner, and you can't see their screen. And so the humans in the middle feel very vulnerable. They're about to get picked off, by the carnivore. And so I think there's something very related to those two things, and come back, because if we can do one thing out of this terrible crisis, if we can kill the open plan office as a result of this, under medical grounds, if nothing, not for productivity grounds, we will have made some good in this world. So I'm going to bounce into clarity just because I want to keep driving forward. And clarity, have to say, was my favourite of all. Don't get me wrong, I love all of the virtues. And maybe because what we were talking about earlier is it speaks to pain. And if I think about the most pain that I've endured in my own personal journey with flexible working, it's been about not providing enough clarity. And I'd also like to bring a little bit of Tony Crabb, who was with us a couple of weeks ago, in on this, because he was talking this brilliant conversation from Tony about, when you're working at home in particular, your sort of siloed world of work and everything else is no longer siloed. It's kind of just everything. And so what you have to do is you have to consider all aspects of your life and how you plan your day and kind of your priorities. And for me, there's a really sort of important lesson, which I think is a crucial part of getting flexible and remote working right, is about thinking about not just your colleagues, but also your extended colleagues, i.e. your family or whoever you share a house with. And that's been, for me, the journey is, the better I am at signaling to everybody around me, whether it's my remote boss or my local wife or son, that actually I'm going to be doing some deeply productive work. I'm going to try and do some deeply productive work. So I'd really appreciate it if I could just have some quiet time. Or, by the way, I'm just dicking around on email for the next couple of hours. So don't worry about, coming and asking questions. That's cool. And I think it's such an important part. And maybe it's a bit of accountability. What you're saying is about taking responsibility for those things and being proactive in communicating them. Is that kind of where you're at on that, or have I just abused that for my own purposes?
No, I think that's a great way to articulate it. I think it's perfect. So what we're talking about with clarity is clearly articulating to people our preferences, where we're at. So Molly Breen, who does research with Philosophy at Work and researched for the report, came up with this great way of talking about it as if we're all taxis, and we've got a way to sort of switch on our light on the cab that says we're taking customers right now, or we're not, not in service or whatever. And it's might be as simple as, so I have a 5-year-old son and a 2.5-year-old son at home, and my office is at home as well, and I've got to put a sign up on the door that says on call or recording or whatever. And that's, I started doing that because I didn't want to be disturbed. But then I realized that, like Brené Brown, the American social work professor, says, clear is kind. And so actually it's not just about my sort of selfish desires. It's more thoughtful to others if I can say, you know what, part of me feels like I don't want to let you down, so I'm going to say I'm available all the time. But actually, that's not very good, because then I'm going to be frustrated because I can't be available all the time. And you're no doubt going to contact me when I'm not really able to do it. But if I can say, I've got the sign on the door, or from this time to this time, I'm doing deep work and I'm not going to be checking my email, or just so you know, there's a signature on my email, just so you know, I check email at 6 and 6 or whatever it might be. Then people know what they're working with and they can crack on in their own ways. So it is being clear, to be kind. It's agreeing together. If it's a team situation or a company situation, here's what we're going to do.
No, absolutely.
Dave, do you remember a long time ago, our good friend Philip Ross used to talk about jelly bean workers? And it never took off. But the jelly bean is the kind of the lozenge that says that you're red, amber, or green. But what about all the other different things you might be? I am being thoughtful at the moment, or I am looking for inspiration, or there's the do not entry sign, which means just do not disturb me. But there are so many different ways of being, and I think that there is definitely mileage in the jelly bean workers to have those lozenges to be different colors, different shapes, and different symbols to show what your current kind of disposition is and how you want to work.
Yeah, no, I'd forgotten about that, and actually that reminds me. We must. I wonder if we can get Philip on to talk about the sort of the evolution of that. But I think sort of communicating it in the way that you've talked about is great, and it sort of leads me to the next one, collegiality, which I love. There's a call out in the report which says just because you can collaborate doesn't mean you should. And you know, for me, the sort of the lockdown work experience has been perhaps a little bit over personified by this sort of ubiquitous Zoom, Teams, Google call that so many people are enjoying, just to say hi. You know, I know I'm not in the office, but I'm still here, and I'm still, well, actually I'm not working because I'm on a bloody Zoom call, but you know what, I need to be seen. And it's this whole thing about how we just let people crack on, and rather than the need that we've always had that everybody has to be included. Nick, you and I, we talked about this in the concept of email, and I know the world has moved on since then, but it's this whole concept of I have to hit reply all. And still to this day, I mean, I don't use reply all at all, but I always worry that, you know, will everybody else think that I've just not responded? So talk to us about, you know, in terms of collegiality, this is really about being proactive in yourself and thinking about what do I actually want? You know, if I'm going to tax somebody's brain power, what do I want out of this? Is that where we're at with this?
Yeah, I mean, what we're talking about here is the way of not being a people pleaser, to sort of put it in like relational psychological talk, but to very much to your reply all point. What I think we're working at a time where social norms are being created, right? And how do we these days? What's the best way to sign off an email? How do we deal with this? Who do we invite to video calls? And there is this sense that, like you're saying with replying all, if I say to someone, could we just pick up the phone and have a phone call and not do the video? Are they, I worry that they're going to feel like I don't want to see their face, and it's going to be an insult or something. Or, well, why wouldn't you want it to be more engaging, or see each other? But actually, I'm a bit tired, or I just want to pick up the phone. And I think a lot of us are in that space. And so it's when we talk about collegiality, we're talking about working on our relationships across our organizations so that they're strong enough where when we're collaborating, it can be focused on the work rather than, well, gosh, I've got to invite this person onto the project because otherwise they're going to feel insulted. No, let's have calls and coffees and things outside of those sorts of situations so that everyone knows, feels confident in our relationship with them. And then when we get down to this, we can go, do you know what? We really need your skills and we really need them right at this time. And so that's why we're going to bring you in. Yeah,
no, I love that. And it made me think of trust again. And when I was reading the report, I was not struggling, but I couldn't figure out where trust lived. And I realize now, the deeper we get into this, trust kind of is a foundation for all of this stuff. Do you know what I mean? It is it's the bedrock that enables this to happen. So, Nick, I mean, the thing that made me think of was in a past project that you and I worked on, there was a lady, and I'd love to remember her surname, but it was a lady called Jennifer, and she had this principle of the work with me document, which was essentially a document that you write about, look, this is, I'm Dave, this is how I work. And I mean, true for me, like my favorite ever form of communication with you is email, because that's kind of asynchronous and it empowers both of us to work as and when we want. After that is video calls. Like, worst case scenario is it's a phone. I just hate phone calls. I don't know what it is. I just bloody hate them. But being open and public about that and saying, look, this is what it's like to work with me. Also, you have to keep me sort of focused because I tend to wander off. And what were we doing anyway? Those kinds of things. Public. So I kind of feel that's that being open and honest about that, and empowering other people to share the same sort of thing and work in that way. You guys did that at Dropbox, didn't you? You sort of started working in that way.
Yeah, so it was Jennifer Brooke who was part of the research team at Dropbox, and she was fantastic. The Work With Me document is a really lovely thing to use, and I used it with my team, a team that I'd been working with for about 2-3 years, and then we filled out these work with me documents, and maybe we can create a template and put it as a link underneath the YouTube site. And we learnt things about each other that we didn't know, even though we'd worked together for 3 years. So if you think that a CV is a kind of everything about your experiences, your background, the job that you've had, the work that you've done, the work with me document is a sort of maybe a similar looking thing, but it's a who I am, what I'm about, what's my style, what's my approach, what are the things that piss me off, what does it look like when I'm having a bad day, what are my pet peeves, what are my chosen forms of communication, what are there's some things about me that you might not know and that you can ask me about. I don't like flying, but I flew a plane solo when I was in the cadets at school. I have a dog, I have 3 kids. These are things that actually back in the probably 90s, people used to have Rolodexes and might scribble stuff on there saying his birthday is the 18th of July, just as a kind of a prompt. And actually those bits that help you understand who you're working with are crucial to how you engage with them, how you work with them. To your point before about Zoom and you hate just the regular phone call, I had someone in my team a while ago who hated being on camera and who would request every so often to be off camera. She found it exhausting. She found it intrusive. She found it, not a pleasant experience. I've seen recently people saying, okay, welcome to the meeting. This is what we're going to talk about. Can everyone have their cameras on so I can see you're engaged? And that's quite an imposing thing to ask. Not everyone feels that that's comfortable or appropriate all the time. Because my camera might be off, it doesn't mean that I'm not engaged or I'm doing email. It just might mean that I didn't brush my hair this morning or whatever it may be. And that understanding and an appreciation of what people might want to do differently, I think is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, which say what I do here, right? Leads me on to the 5th and final virtue of understanding, which surely is kind of what sits underneath all of this. Is just simply understanding, and I'm going to say celebrating that people work in different ways, right? And it's finding the balance, of all of these things together. Is that really where we're at with understanding? Is there more to it than that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The only thing that I want to draw out is another point about the way that the virtues work, at least the ones that we came up with in the report, is that the extremes that we see. So, for example, in the case of understanding, there's extremes which are not really good. They're not really helpful, but they're totally understandable. And so we can learn from them and then come to the sort of balanced virtue in the middle. And with the case with understanding, the other thing to say is that where we got from that is the overreaction is, when we're having meetings like this and we're on video calls, we're so desperate in our better moments to let other people know that we're really listening to them and engaged, that it can almost be an overdone strength. So how do you do it? Do you sort of do lots of listening noises, and stuff like that, and then that just sort of gets in the way and it sort of ruins their flow? That's one overreaction. The underreaction is going, do you know what? I so don't want to do that. I don't want to be cringy or make them feel uncomfortable. Maybe they don't want to have their videos off, so I'm just gonna suggest that we have no videos and we're gonna completely downplay the whole thing, and then that hurts our ability to understand each other. So what we're saying is, do you know what? Whether or not you have videos on or off, the important thing is that you understand each other's preferences. And again, it might feel like, well, did Aristotle talk about understanding? Are we doing philosophy anymore? Or is this like a group therapy session? And I would say that, actually we're doing philosophy because philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom, which is better ways to live. We're not really talking about quotes from ancient thinking or something like that. What we're doing is very philosophical, though, because we're critically engaging with how we're living our lives and going, do you know what, is it best to have the video on or off? That's an important question for us to be asking. And so I think it's understanding is a really important one. And what we're talking about is getting curious about each other's preferences. I also love the work with me document thing. I use it all the time, use it a lot. And I love it for this reason, that it makes us have the conversations we need to be having to be thinking through together about how we want to work.
I have to say, I mean, that's massively profound, which was not something I was expecting to get on a live stream that I was hosting. But, you know, I deeply, deeply love it. And it's this pursuit of wisdom, the pursuit of wanting to be better. Now, Brennan, I know in the report, the way that you've carved out the 5 virtues, in order to help people engage with them, you've kind of put a series of questions at the end of each virtue that they, you know, as an individual or as a team, you can kind of ask yourselves. And I get that, and I think it's brilliant. But because I'm trying to wrap things up and I want to get people really focused on what they can do, I'll put the link to the report in the comments of the section. What's the one thing, if you've been at all interested in this conversation or in the report, apart from reading the report, what's the one thing that you can do that's going to help you down that path to make a difference?
So I'm going to give a really vague answer that is one thing, but it's vague. And then I'll unpack it just a very little bit. So the high level vague, but I think true answer is think for yourself and ask lots of questions. I think that's what we've always needed, but I think we particularly need it when we're going through change. And I think we need it right now because so many things are being broken down and rebuilt. And we need people that are not just going to go, oh yeah, we've always worked like this, so we're just going to keep working like this. Or we've never worked like this, and that means it's a bad thing. And we need people that, we need all of us. And it's, you know, I'm not saying I do this correctly all the time because I'm a philosopher or something, but we need to be thinking for ourselves and asking lots of questions. And the more pragmatic, specific thing for those of us that want to go, yeah, but what do I do with that tomorrow? Is, you know, go into that next conversation that you have. There's lots of conversations these days that have already broken the ice for this kind of conversation because we're already talking about, gosh, how do we do this autumn? You know, when we go phase of working, how are we going to navigate this? What are we doing? Those conversations already happening right now. So you can have a conversation that would have been really hard to get into a couple months ago. Now is at your fingertips. And in those conversations, instead of just going, yep, how are we going to do transport? Or how are we going to, you know, are we going to have cubicles or something? In the midst of those conversations, something you can do is say, what did you really enjoy? What worked well for you in the sort of lockdown phase when it was purely sort of virtual, if that was your world? And what did you find really difficult? And then that's going to open up some of the conversations for, you know, you're already being more democratic because you're asking for other people's opinions. It's opening up a space where maybe you can be more accountable and say, okay, I'm going to help solve that pain point. We're getting more clear. We're having more relationship building and collegiality, and we're starting to understand. So I think going into conversations and saying, you know, that very sort of coach-like question, what worked well, what didn't work well, is a great start.
Yeah, no, I love that. And once again, it brings me back to Tony and what Tony Crabb was saying a couple of weeks ago, which was sort of giving people permission to talk about those things or, you know, setting the stage such that they can bring that stuff rather than the other example you were saying, you know, forcing people to say, what didn't work? We're going to work like this. So I think that's a really lovely way for us to sort of close out. So I'm going to thank Nick. I'm going to thank Brennan. It's been fantastic that you could join us. The report, again, link you'll find there, but it's really, really worth your while reading. It's very easy to get into and lots of great things that you can do. And all that really it remains for me to say is just thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again for giving us your Wednesday evening. I do have to do this because I'm just so proud of this. I spent the morning making this. Give us a like, subscribe if you haven't. We'd love to have you with us on the journey. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will see you all again next week. Thanks, guys. Take care.
There are 1,000 stories in the Envisioners' future. This is just one of them.